And I'm going to cut my video. Okay, we're live. I'll let you take it from here. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me just confirm everything looks good over here, and fantastic. Welcome, everyone, whether it be morning, afternoon, or evening. Today, we're going to continue in our community office hours sessions. Today, we're going to be talking about the Azure provider, and I'm joined today by Tom Bamford, Tom Harvey, and Steve Jones. So welcome everyone. Would love to, do you want to start with an intro, Tom Bamford?
Yeah, sure. So I've been with HashiCorp about 7.5 months, I think, and I started on the Azure providers team. I've done some work on the Azure AD provider and planning for a new major release coming up in the near future for that. And yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Would love to shift over to you, Tom Harvey. Would you like to introduce yourself and just kind of share some more details about what you do here at HashiCorp?
Hey, yeah, I'm Tom Harvey. I'm the lead engineer on the Azure provider. So I've been here for coming up to 3.5, 4 years now. And yeah, I mean, I've been on it since a few months after it started being a thing. So yeah.
Awesome.
Steve, how about you?
Hey, Steve Jones. Sorry, I've been kind of busy getting the release out today, so I'm a little bit shell-shocked. I've been on the provider now for about 10 months. Previously, I was a Azure and cloud consultant, kind of helping people, and a great advocate of HashiCorp products for years and years. So I'm now in effectively my dream job. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at now. Now helping everybody else kind of on board with Azure through the HashiCorp providers.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Today, we're going to dive into some questions that have been asked around the community, and I'm very excited to get to those. Before we dive into those, please ask everyone to abide by the code of conduct that we have here at our HashiCorp office hours, and that simplifies down to please be excellent to one another. So I wanted to share that out as well. With that, the first question that I have for y'all today, and if you kind of want to, first one to answer that, more than happy to jump over to that. So feel free to raise your hand or signal, or just shout over one another. That works sometimes as well. When talking with some of the teams internally at HashiCorp, one of the questions that I asked was, what's new for the Azure provider? And they had mentioned that a lot of performance enhancements were done recently, and really wanted to open up the floor to that and kind of ask, what are those performance enhancements that you've done with the Azure provider so far? And what's coming up?
I guess I'll take this one. So yeah, I mean, we've been, there are different APIs used on the Azure side. There are two different types, as Resource Manager and Data Plane. To be able to query between them, we get information from Resource Manager and then call the Data Plane API. So for storage or for Key Vault or whatever else. We've done a bunch of caching improvements for storage. We're also doing some more, we've got some more lined up for Key Vault as well. Which should mean that when you're running Terraform and larger subscriptions from now on, that we can basically dramatically improve the performance of that by caching that data. We've also got some longer term enhancements planned for the provider as a whole, which should reduce the number of HTTP calls we're making as well, which would definitely help here. Awesome. I don't know if you want to talk more about Azure AD there, Tom.
Yeah, I guess we've got anybody who's following the Azure AD project may have noticed that we are busy working on adopting the Microsoft Graph API, which is the newer API Microsoft have available for querying Azure AD tenants. And not only is that going to give us a lot more functionality, but it's definitely going to improve performance. There are many cases where operations take a lot longer with the deprecated API, sometimes due to consistency issues, and sometimes literally due to things just take longer there. Sort of, you get the impression that, that there might be more of a queuing system behind that API, whereas things are a little bit snappier with Microsoft Graph. So that's definitely going to help performance in a big way.
Awesome. I'm very excited to hear. I know that it's always fun, in air quotes, when you're working on something or you have a resource that might take a little bit longer to spin up. So greatly excited for all of those enhancements coming our way. The next question that I had, so when you work with Terraform, working with different providers can always kind of be, it's always a new experience based on what that provider actually needs. If it's an API key, an endpoint, things like that. One question that is, has been asked a lot around the community on Reddit, HashiCorp's Discuss, and other platforms are how to effectively use service principals. And just kind of getting an idea of how service principals work. And so would love to kind of dig into that with you, whoever wants to grab that question. Would really like to hear more on that front.
Sure, yeah, I don't mind taking that. So yeah, service principals is one of the things that can be a bit confusing with Azure. I mean, ultimately, a service principal is basically a security principle, and it sort of goes hand in hand with user principles. And so in sort of architecturally within Azure, you have what you call a tenant, which is essentially your directory, which houses all these principles and other sort of metadata. And you associate subscriptions with a tenant. So each tenant can have several subscriptions associated with it. And therein you can assign permissions using those principles from the tenant that the subscriptions linked to your resources inside your subscription. So that's the sort of gist of it, really. Service principals are also tricky because how they're used has sort of changed over time in Azure. So they used to be a much more straightforward type of object. But they store more and more data as the capabilities of Azure kind of improves over time. So one of the big things has been sort of with the introduction of application registrations, they essentially split a service principal into two entities. And there's a lot to decode in the back end there, but basically what it means is when you want to authenticate with a service principal, what you also need is an app registration that's linked to that service principal. And topologically, an app registration is essentially a global object. So although it lives in Azure AD, it has global scope. And the service principal, you get one, you have a service principal registered within each tenant that you want to administer. And each of those service principals is linked to the app registration. The credentials that you use when you're authenticating to Azure are then, they no longer reside in the service principal, they reside in the app registration. So as long as you have that sort of setup where you have an app and a service principal linked in the tenant that you want to communicate with, you should be good to go.
It's also probably worth adding there around managed identities. So a managed identity is basically just a service principal on the back end. What that means is certain Azure services, so app service or compute, like a virtual machine or a container, they can automatically get a managed identity, which is a service principal in its own right, which you can then assign roles and permissions to. And Terraform, both Azure AD and the Terraform backend and Azure RM, all support service principals and managed identities. So we can automatically look up these credentials for you, meaning that there's no secrets embedded in the application itself. We just look them up from the Azure metadata service in each case. So it's a really, service principals are really interesting, particularly around the auth methods available. Even on the just service principals themselves also support certificates as well as username password credentials, which gives you a bunch of different options there. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think, yeah, the last time I had to deal with principals was probably back in school. So exciting to, to have them back in my life. Moving on to our next question. Have there been any exciting resources added to the Azure provider recently? Do you have any favorites that you've seen kind of come in, or any that you see on the horizon that people are asking about?
So, I mean, there's some popular ones that that come up a lot. Like AKS is obviously always changing. There's always new functionality coming there. Whilst that isn't a new resource in its own right, there are continually changes to AKS. Of late, a lot of the work we've been doing is around, or a lot of the resources that have shipped are around security and networking. So we have, like Virtual Hub is a good example where you can have virtual hubs and virtual hubs connections, and then private link connecting resources together. So private link is quite interesting. It's being added to different Azure resources behind the scenes. So like a SQL Server or MySQL or whatever other services you're adding. We support the endpoint, and we're going through and we're adding those in as necessary. So it's a really exciting capability to put this stuff privately rather than publicly as they've been previously. And then, as Tom mentioned, the Microsoft Graph stuff enables a bunch more in the near future. So it's exciting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom. My next question is really just an experience question. And do you have any helpful tips or tricks that you found in using the Azure provider? Any cookbook recipes, anything of that nature?
Tom, why don't you start with this, because you both used it in production recently.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. That's a really, it's kind of a tricky one. I guess a lot of the patterns that I would suggest with the Azure provider possibly apply to Terraform as a whole, which is sort of like, and this is my personal preference, but you know, try and keep your modules sort of like business oriented, but also as lean as you can. Yeah, I guess yeah, that's pretty much my sort of main philosophy when I'm building a Terraform configuration, really.
I think in my experience, depends on has been a big part of some of the Azure work that I've been working on. In some cases, even if you have, I've noticed in a couple modules I've had dependency names, or I'm sourcing from an upstream value from a resource or a module, and I'll still have to put that depends on within some of those declarations. So I've seen some things in terms of dependency that's been helpful to kind of have a sense of that, is like be a little bit more explicit when you're dealing with those resources or specific types of modules. And then I've really found a lot of modules from Azure very helpful, when I go and look at that Terraform registry page for all those. So it's been quite helpful.
It's probably also worth adding the features block as one example. So you can control the behavior of the Azure provider. So let's say you have a data disk attached to a virtual machine, and you might want to clean those up in a CI or a staging environment, but you might want to but you may want to keep them in a production environment. What the features block inside the provider allows you to do is say, turn this feature on or off, like this behavioral feature. And that feature could be, should I automatically purge the key vault keys once we delete the key vault? Should I delete the OS disk? Should I, all these behavioral features that they're listed on the provider website. But it means that you can control how the provider behaves on a per environment level or per subscription level, I guess, which is really nice and flexible. That the other thing to mention here for me is that we have these association resources that help work around some of the limitations in Azure, where you can create something but not necessarily destroy it. So yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of these now, but the general intention is that you can design things in such a manner that you can spin it up and tear it down. Because yeah, I know some people like to spin up their environment at 7 a.m. and turn it down at 6 p.m. So.
Oh, it sounds like fun. Maybe we can make a game of it at some point in time and see if we can create some constraints to make that happen. Awesome. Thank you, Tom and Tom. So with that, tips and tricks and kind of brushing on modules, are there any favorite Azure modules that you have out there? So far, I think myself, the biggest one that I found was the AKS module. I thought that one was quite handy. How about yourself?
Yeah, AKS is one of our most popular resources as a whole. Like just ignoring modules for a minute. But yeah, when you come to modules, obviously because it's one of our most popular resources, it's one of the most popular modules. There's some other really nice ones the Microsoft team have put out as well, like default network setups. And I know like some of the default security group rules as well, I believe fall under the Azure org, if memory serves. But it's a really nice way of flexibly saying that, hey, I quickly saying that I want to create a network security group with these rules applied for, you know, remote desktop or for SSH or for whatever else. So, yeah.
Awesome. Tom, do you have any favorite Azure modules whatsoever?
Well, you mentioned the AKS one, which I've used a couple of times, but I found it certainly robust enough for general use. Yeah, I'll be honest. I haven't kept super on top of the latest modules coming out, but yeah, that one definitely stood out to me in the past.
I think that is a good point. It is kind of difficult to keep an eye because it is open source and an open platform, and anyone can create a module. It is difficult to stay on top of some of the new ones that are coming out. And I know the registry does, or Terraform registry does a very good job of kind of sourcing those, and you do have fuzzy search. You can kind of explore and take a look at things. But yeah, it's been fun to see some of the new modules coming out that have come out, but who knows? Maybe we'll see a newsletter in the not too near future about some of the fun modules that are coming up. Awesome. I did see a few questions in the chat. I'm going to hit those very shortly. I have one last question here, and then we're going to move over to live questions. So please submit any questions if you have them, or as you have them, and we'll be sure to go through those. The last pre-submitted question that I had today is, what's the best way to get involved around the Azure provider modules? What's if I'm just kind of starting my journey on my open source journey, or just trying to write some modules and get them out there, or work on the provider itself, what's the best way to go about doing that?
I'll speak and then I'll let the other two speak. So I mean, we try and apply good first issue labels to issues as they come up, and a lot of folks get involved that way and then gradually build up over time. So we have a lot of repeat contributors, which are really nice, and folks that we work with all the time. Tom and Steve actually both came in via the community route as well. So yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about that and how you got involved.
Yeah, sure. Well, for me, it was kind of a slow drip, really, but it was really about scratching my own itches, really. So if I came up against a particular issue in my use case, and I felt that I could solve it, yeah, I threw a contribution in, and certainly at that point for me, it definitely felt really approachable. Like my contributions were definitely welcomed, and that's something that for me, I'd like to think that we keep that up. Yeah, I guess as a sort of like team member now, I think one of the things might be like, so if there's something that you want to solve for your own use case, and you have a look around the issues, and maybe there's one or two other related things, yeah, we're more than happy to accept contributions that fix more than one problem.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom and Tom. I would say, like they had mentioned, if anyone has any questions, or if you want to sit down and pair, or if you just kind of want to talk things through, I'm also always available. My handle is @onlydole, just about everywhere on GitHub, Twitter, and throughout the internet. I'll be sure to share a link in the chat before we close things up today. But don't be a stranger. If you have a question, I'd be more than happy to answer that. If I don't know, happy to work with you to figure that out, or to talk to people on our team that might be able to have that answer as well. Awesome. So with that, we can start to dive into some of these live questions that have been submitted. The first one is, which is the best way to spin up multiple resources? So typically how you can do that, and you can do step one, which I think is a little bit more verbose, and ultimately it may be a good way to start, but you really want to kind of shrink things down and keep your code such that you don't repeat yourself, keep your code dry. You can declare each of those variables. So say I had 3 units of compute or 3 storage buckets. You could list each of those out. That's not terribly effective though, because then you have a very giant file. If you wanted to spin up, 100 of that resource, it doesn't really make sense, right? One of the other options that you have is called count. And count, as of Terraform 0.13, gives you a way to use count with modules as well. So you don't have to use just that resource. You can now use modules and kind of get those on a count as well, which is quite helpful. For something that needs a little bit more specificity, or if you need to give it additional configuration, you have for each. So you can use either, you can create a list or a variable, something of that nature, and then specify what you need. If it needs to be more complex, say if you wanted to, create a disk size and a name, you could do a little bit more complex data structure like that, and then declare those things out using for each, and then doing that with either resource or module. And then one notable thing is depends on as well. We talked about that a little bit earlier. You can also use that for your modules as well now, with anything at Terraform 0.13 or later. So that's those are some ways that you can spin up multiple resources, and then that kind of reflecting on ways in which those dependencies relate to one another. So hope that is helpful, and hope that answers that question. Next question is, what would be the best practice to do something with the provider that isn't implemented, but that you could do with a few lines of the Azure CLI? I'd like to turn that over to you, Tom, or Steve.
I'll start for this one then. Yeah, so Terraform supports these things called provisioners, and what these do is allow you to run commands either locally or remotely. And so, for example, you can run a command line script locally, or run the Azure CLI locally, or you could, SSH in and run this command on this machine. But what's super nice about this is you can mix and match these together. So you could provision, let's take a virtual machine, and then use a null resource in the null provider to use a local exec provisioner, which allows you to run the Azure CLI locally. So you can mix and match Terraform and the Azure provider together as you need to. One other thing of note here is, as of the last couple of releases, the new ARM template resource will also clean up resources it deploys to. So historically, we just deployed resources but didn't clean them up when you ran destroy. We now do that. So you can mix and match Azure CLI with local provisioners, or an ARM template with the new Azure RM resource group template deployment resource, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it works. Or using a provisioner, as I said. So the local exec provisioner is the way forward there.
Awesome. Let me take a look here and see what questions we have. Next question is, can we get more resources for the Azure Stack provider in the future? Honestly, I'd like to follow that up with, if you wouldn't mind providing some more information about the Azure Stack provider and just kind of covering that, and then some plans that you have there. I think that'd be helpful.
Sure. So Azure itself has different regions. So there is Azure Public, there is Azure China, Azure Germany, Azure Government, etc. But one of these is a different type of Azure region that you can run on premise called Azure Stack. And what this does is you buy some new hardware and it comes with basically Azure running in your data center. And so you can spin up certain kinds of Azure resources like VMs or Kubernetes clusters or other types of Azure resources, basically using a similar or using the same language, using HCL the same way you would for Azure RM or for Azure AD or any other Terraform provider. So we have, because of the way Azure Stack works, it's rather different to Azure RM insofar as Azure Public releases new things all the time and they roll out to different Azure regions like Germany and China. Azure Stack is more of a snapshot once in a while. So you, the administrator on premise, will update your Azure Stack instance once a month, once a quarter. So there's a bit of a lag between Azure Public and Azure Stack, which means there's different functionality available on both. And so what that means in Terraform is that we have a separate provider for it. There's the Azure RM provider for Public, for Germany, for whatever else. And then there's Azure Stack, which is for the Azure Stack provider. Because most of the requests we get are for Azure Public, we spend the most of our time there. But yeah, I mean, if there's feature requests and things, please file an issue and we'll take a look when we get a chance.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's take a look at some more questions. What's the best way to get started with Terraform and Azure for starters? So one thing that I would like to highlight is the Learn HashiCorp links. I know I'm biased, I work at HashiCorp, but even before that, I would always refer to the HashiCorp Learn site. I think it's one of the best places to find resources on just about anything that you'd like to learn pertaining to Terraform, Vault, Nomad, Console, Waypoint, Boundary. There are so many tracks to take a look at there. There's so many things to learn. And then if you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out either to me or the team. We also have discuss.hashicorp.com, and that is our community forum. So if you have any questions that you want focused on, or if you need help with anything that you're having some issues with, all feedback is welcome there in terms of pertaining to Terraform or anything else if you want to help get that solved. There are a lot of other practitioners that meet there as well and take a look at some of those issues too. So again, if you have any questions, that's a great place to, once you're in your learning experience, to kind of source those questions and get some feedback and some help on that front. All right. And with that, I don't see any more questions, but if you have any questions, please feel free to post those into the chat. I'm going to scroll through here, but while we wait for some more questions, do you have any input, Tom or Steve, around some of the things that are upcoming for the Azure provider, or just, even if it's just some longer term things of where you'd want to see that provider go?
I'll start off with that if it's all right. So yeah, I mean, Azure is continually adding functionality all the time. What we're trying to do in Terraform is to expose that in a way where it's useful. So expose all the resources we can, but make sure they actually work and are usable by users. So a lot of the work we're doing at the moment is around that, around shipping functionality, basically shipping new stuff when it's in preview, when it's through GA. So we're working very closely with Microsoft there. There's some upcoming work around both Azure AD, as Tom mentioned, for Microsoft Graph, and Azure RM in the near future, to enable us to move faster there as well, which is super exciting. So yeah, basically new shiny.
I'm always a fan of the new and the shiny and the best practices on that front. Awesome.
definitely.
Yeah, with Azure AD, it's once we have reached a point where we can start fully adopting the Microsoft Graph API, that's going to open up a lot of potential opportunities for implementing new features and new resources. Yeah, so when that happens, you keep an eye out. I mean, the scope of Microsoft Graph is pretty large. It extends to a lot of other Microsoft services as well, which are intrinsically sort of linked to Azure AD. So yeah, there could be a lot of exciting features in the future there.
I guess
Sorry. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, as a general rule, one thing we try and do when we talk about GitHub issues and getting involved and in general, and also new features, is that when we go to implement a new feature and we're looking for, what should we work on next, what PRs should we review next, we generally sort by the thumbs up. So if there's a particular issue that or a new feature that you're looking for, please thumbs up it on GitHub. And the more thumbs up there are, the more we can pay attention to it. Sometimes there's some upstream blockers there. And we are working with Microsoft to unblock them there. But yeah, I mean, if there's an issue you're looking for or a feature you're looking for, please either open a GitHub issue if there isn't one, or thumbs up it, and that'll definitely help. So
awesome. That did bring to mind one question, and dealing with any major cloud can be a bit exhausting when it comes to all of the resources that are, some that are coming out, potentially some that are getting deprecated. How do you stay on top of, kind of everything that is shifting when it comes to the Azure cloud and those APIs?
Yeah, I mean, we have a close working relationship with Microsoft, so we get a heads up for some of this stuff. There's obviously Ignite and Build, the Microsoft conferences, once a year each. But we also, I mean, internally we have feeds as well. So if there's a new blog post comes out, or we think something looks interesting, or the customer requests it, or whatever it is, we kind of work out what's useful from that. So to take the virtual machine resources as a good example, Azure offers one API for creating a virtual machine, but there's actually 3 different types of virtual machine that you can create. There's a Linux machine, there's a Windows machine, there's this thing called an orchestrated virtual machine. And so what we do in Terraform is to expose that in a manner where it's useful by having those as separate resources, where we can then provide more validation to you. So we can say that, hey, if you're running on Windows, then your the computer name has to be within X characters, or if you're on Linux, it can be this many characters. So we're trying to expose this functionality in a way that's useful. And so yeah, I mean, if we see a new feature that comes out, we try and add it in that manner. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I still have a lot of respect for what y'all do every single day in terms of keeping up to date with everything there, because it's not a boring experience whatsoever, I'm sure. One question that we had come in was, when will the 1.x Azure provider be deprecated?
That is a good question. At this point in time, we're no longer shipping new features for 1x. So at this point in time, we would recommend moving to 2.0. If there's a reason you can't, we'd love to hear it, because we'd like to make that a smoother transition as we can. So there's an upgrade guide for that. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, we haven't published like an official end of life guide for that or anything. So for context, we released version 2 around, I can't remember the start or the end of February this year, but it's a while ago now. So at this point, 1x has been, or 2.0 has been out for a while. I think we're up to 238 now, 236, something like that.
235 today.
Thank you. It's a lot of releases. But yeah, I mean, there isn't an official end date for that, but I would strongly recommend moving to Terraform 2, to Azure 2. Whatever if you can. The main benefit for that is that continues to work with new versions of Terraform Core. So Terraform Core is currently on 0.13 something. We have 0.14 in beta, and there's new changes coming in there. So the 1x release will not work with new versions of Terraform Core. So in short, if you want to stay up to date, you probably want to update to Azure version 2 if you can.
Excellent. Let me check our questions here. And there is a question. I have one more question, then I don't have any new ones. So again, if you have any questions for Tom, Steve, or myself, please be sure to drop them in the chat and we can get those answered. We'd be more than happy to help out with that today. The next question we have is any possibility to get vouchers for the Terraform exam? So with that, I really recommend that you take a look at your local HUG chapter. HUG stands for Human User Group, and encourage the organizer to host a certification meetup. At that point in time, then we can start to talk about vouchers and things like that with your local HUG organizer. So I'm going to put a link here and in the chat. And if you want to kind of work with them, talk with them on that front, please do so. All right, I just saw a question come in here from Ivan. Can the Azure provider for Terraform manage every aspect of the Azure platform? As in, is it limited in any capacity?
Yeah, so there's a slight difference between ARM templates and Terraform as a whole. So Terraform providers are basically wrapping the Azure APIs that exist. So in fact, to go through ARM templates first. So ARM templates allow you to deploy, there's very similar to CloudFormation templates if you've used AWS. They allow you to provision resources against Azure's Resource Manager API. So it allows you to provision the bulk of resources in Terraform, but Azure also has these APIs called data plane APIs. And so Terraform, or the Azure provider for Terraform, mixes and matches both the Resource Manager and the data plane APIs. So we don't support every single feature of every single resource provider that is out there, but we do support additional functionality as well through the data plane resources. So at this point, I would say the bulk of the resources are covered, or the bulk of the use cases are covered. If there's something specific you're looking for, please open a GitHub issue, and we can, route it to an existing issue or prioritize it as necessary. But as a general rule, I would say the majority of use cases are supported at this point. But it's also worth mentioning, as we mentioned earlier, you can mix and match both the Azure CLI and an ARM template from within Terraform. So you should be able to access the majority of Azure features at this point, if not everything. But yeah, if there is something missing, please let us know and we'll take a look.
And another reminder that if you do see an issue or anything that you want to see implemented, or you kind of want to get that feedback on, yes, this looks like something that I want to be explored or worked on, please add a reaction to that. Thumbs up, heart, ta-da emoji, whatever suits you on that front, and that'll kind of get it under our eyes and kind of make it stand out a little bit more than some of the other issues as well. Awesome. I'd love to open up for any more questions. It looks like we've kind of gotten through the ones that we've had so far. In the meantime, again, would urge people to check out the learn and discuss.HashiCorp links. Those are quite useful in terms of kind of opening up that discussion or learning something new. And then, if you do have any questions other than around that or how to use those, please feel free to reach out to us.
If I might add one other thing to that, we ship the Azure provider roughly weekly, the Azure RM provider that is, and similar to the AWS and the Google providers also ship weekly, I believe. But if you're on GitHub, you can subscribe to releases now, so you can get a notification whenever we do a release. So if you're looking to stay up to date, the changelog there is super handy. We try and keep it up to date and try and keep it as complete as we can. So it's also just worth a shout out there.
That does bring to mind one question and one that I've seen kind of pop up across different providers and and Terraform Core. One thing to note, to everyone that's watching today, is that Terraform is made up of a lot of components. There's Terraform Core, which is core functionality. Then there are the providers, and then within the providers, there's the resource code. And so Terraform isn't just this one repository that you can look at. It is it is a bit sprawling. That's the great thing about Terraform, is the fact that there are so many plugins that you can integrate with it, but also that you do have that core functionality. So sometimes finding the right place to look for something or raise up an issue might be a little bit confusing if you're just kind of starting your journey in that respect. When it comes to you had talked about releases, Tom, and things like that. Are there any things in terms of testing that we can be on the lookout for? Or is there anything that you've seen effective in terms of testing things pertaining to the Azure provider?
So I mean, this is a larger question for Terraform providers in general. So for all of the ones that all the providers that we maintain, I guess that's probably worth a step back. So Terraform providers are built both internally by us. There are partner created providers like VMware, ShibaBunch. There are customers who make their own providers for whatever internal clouds. For the ones that we build at HashiCorp, we run acceptance tests every night, or in some cases, through the day as we're working on pull requests and things. But what that means is we go through and we try and create a resource, update it, delete it, check it actually works end to end, and check these scenarios. So we have quite a large number of tests at this point. I'm saying in the region 2,500, 3,000 tests or something. And we run those every night, which, takes a while. But it means we test all the use cases that we support. So from our side, when we get a pull request, we both, check the code works, that kind of thing. We also check it actually works within Azure by provisioning a real resource. So in the case of AKS, we'll spin up an AKS cluster, check that, if I provision it with this network configuration, does it spin up correctly? Can I destroy it? Or in the case of like capturing a machine image, if I spin up a virtual machine, can I capture an image of that and then provision a secondary machine with it? So we have some really complex tests there. And most of the providers at this point, all of the HashiCorp supported ones have those kind of tests. So we're validating these use cases work all the time, which means we can also pick up like regressions and that kind of thing. So yeah, tests are really important to us.
Excellent. One question that was asked is, are there any tips with starting to contribute code to the provider? So we touched on that one a little bit previously, but really the best thing is to kind of find an area that's of interest to you, either a piece of functionality that you need or an issue that you see you might like to get involved with or help solve. And so really just taking a look at GitHub, and then feel free to either within that GitHub issue ask some clarifying questions or anything of that nature, or reach out on discuss.hashicorp.com if you have any other questions, and we'd be more than happy to help out on those fronts. Another question is it possible to make your nightly acceptance test public in any way to give us insight to where the trouble is?
It's something we've wanted to do for a long time. In practice, there's challenges with that. So, we are using real credentials with a credit card that costs us real money. And whilst we try our best to guarantee the logs are, removed of anything remotely sensitive, it doesn't mean they necessarily are. So as a general rule, longer term, we'd love to say that, hey, we've got these 100 virtual machine tests and 95% of them are fine. In practice, that's harder than it seems, but it is something we want to do. It's easy. It's worth mentioning here. It's easier with some providers than it is with others. So I know there's a provider of TeamCity actually that comes to mind, where they actually just spin up a TeamCity server locally in Docker, run the test against it, and so you can get all the tests there. Run it locally, or you can run it in whatever CI system you want actually, and get the test results that way. The problem for us, for AWS, for Azure, for Google, etc., is there are so many tests and they cost quite a bit of money. So reproducing that locally is challenging. But if you want, you could run these yourself as well if there's an area that's particularly interesting to you. But at this point in time, unfortunately, we don't. But it is something I think we'd like to do at some point, or something we certainly talked about anyway.
That'd be really interesting. I know that's always kind of difficult to, to find that right balance to, abstract away your sensitive values and things like that, and not expose those, as well as, provide something to the community that's pretty helpful. when it comes to roadmaps for the Azure provider, I know that that's kind of been something that's been asked of other open source projects, or just just everything around GitHub. I've seen some of our providers and some of our projects, they've started to create like a roadmap MD. Do you have anything like that for the Azure provider today, or just any insight on how you go about kind of planning for the provider?
So Azure RM and Azure AD are slightly different here. So Azure AD, well, actually, both Azure RM and Azure AD published like a pinned GitHub issue. For us, for Azure RM, we did it in for 2.0 way back this time last year. Azure AD has the same thing at the moment for their Microsoft Graph changes, basically saying like, here's the long-term plan essentially for the next major release. We don't do major releases super often, so it's once a year or so. But yeah, I mean, as a whole, we don't have a roadmap.md right now, just because Azure changes quite frequently. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if Tom wants to talk more about the upcoming changes to Azure AD. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, recently on Azure AD, we had we did kind of like have like a project that we set up to kind of track issues that we wanted to include in the 1.0 release, and it's possible we might do something similar for 2.0. So that would be a sort of nice visual representation. I mean, the challenge there is breaking that down into issues that you can represent, which, I mean, obviously we do track our work, but intermixing those with feature requests and other things which are coming in the future is a bit of a challenge. But yeah, we do have the pinned issue, which kind of hopefully summarizes things quite nicely. And certainly on the Azure AD one, there is a checklist on there, although it's quite broad items on there, but it should hopefully give an indication of progress as we progress through it.
I guess on a more macro level as well, we have the milestones on the GitHub site, but they are more, the next month rather than the next quarter or the next year. I believe AWS's roadmap is for the next 3 months. We haven't done that yet. But yeah, I mean, the milestones, the way to find out what's happening in the next month, essentially, or if something is blocked, or if we want to do it as a general thing in the future. So that's on the GitHub site. If you go to issues and then milestones, you can see them there.
Excellent. I don't see any more questions that have come in, but if you'd like to submit some questions, I have a gut feel that we're rounding the bend here and getting close to the end. With that, please submit any questions that you have. One that I have to kind of start to round things out is, what is the most fun thing that you have run Terraform destroy on? That's a question for everybody.
Well, at a previous job, we did have to lift and shift from one account to another. So that was a few tenants with quite a few subscriptions, with quite a few resources. And yeah, once we had got it all set up in its new home, Terraform Destroy was what we used to demolish the old.
Nice. I think mine's probably cheating a bit. We have this thing called a Dalek. So we spin up test resources all the time. And, we are building against it. Sometimes, you finish at 4 o'clock and you might forget to run Terraform Destroy. So we have this thing called the Dalek that just goes ahead and cleans these up for us. So literally go through the subscription. Do I find anything that's a test resource, or is it, a lingering resource because we've forgotten to destroy it? And it'll just go through and destroy those for us. So it's not quite Terraform Destroy, but it is the same thing. But it's really nice. That actually saves us a bunch of money as well, which is, a nice thing.
Yeah, the repo for that is public, so you could go ahead and run it in your own subscription if you want, but do be careful.
Yeah, maybe don't run against production.
Yeah, here there be dragons warning. Very nice. One thing that I've always found it really helpful when you're able to really commit to Terraform and use that to blueprint and spin up and plan for your accounts. I worked at a few jobs past. We had an automated system in terms of setting up AWS accounts, and which is nice. But when it came time to decommission those, you had to show that there was no more spend on that account. It was called critical spend. And even if that was just a penny, it's still considered critical spend. They wanted to be cautious and not shut down anything that was potentially being used, which is, erring on safe instead of sorry, which is good. And Terraform made that very easy. I had a few colleagues that had to use the I think it was AWS nuke to kind of get rid of those accounts, but they could have just saved themselves some time and trouble if they just used Terraform. But it served as a, a good inspiring story to ways that we spun up accounts moving forward. Awesome. All right. I don't see any more questions, but really would like to thank all of you for joining us here today, both on the stream, and Tom, and Steve. Thank you so much for joining us today and kind of shedding more light on the Azure provider, ways that we could help, some interesting features and fun facts about it. I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and we'll be chatting with you soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
Taylor. Cheers.
Thanks a lot.